A surge in coronavirus cases forcing California's Bay Area to roll back its reopening plans. NBC News correspondent Jacob Ward joining us now. Jake, what's going on in the Bay Area?
You know, Allison, this place was really the standard bearer for how the nation should handle this coronavirus. You'll remember that on March 16th, before anyone else was thinking about shutting down, shelter-in-place orders were put in place for the 8 million people of the Bay Area, where I'm standing right now. And we reaped the benefits. There was an early flattening of the curve, which is what everyone was after. Now we're actually seeing some good news in the last week when it comes to California as a whole, a drop of about a fifth when it comes to the average weekly positive test rate. But here in the Bay Area, we are suddenly seeing a surge. We've seen for, again, the 8 million people of the Bay Area, a rise from a daily average of 217 new cases in the middle of June up to now an average of over 870 cases a day as of just a couple of days ago. And that seems to indicate both a sort of complacency on the part of people who are going back to gatherings, and of course, it's falling most heavily on the essential workers, the underprivileged communities, all of the people that are doing the hard work for California. We saw, for instance, that here in Alameda County, Oakland, where I'm standing, Latinos accounted for more than half of the new cases most recently, and yet that group only accounts for about 22% of the county as a whole. So it's falling very hard on people who have to work. And so whether it's desperation, complacency, the coronavirus is definitely finding purchase here in California, Alice.
And Jake, let's not forget about local businesses, small businesses struggling to get through this that may have to close again. What are their plans? How are they trying to get through this? It just, my heart breaks for them, because every time they think that they've made some progress, maybe they might get back to business, there's another setback.
There's really no good outcome for almost any business right now, Allison. You're absolutely right. I mean, when you look at the July 13th order put in place by the state of California, you're seeing everything: malls, personal care services, that's massage parlors, that's salons, that's hairstylists, all the way through to anyone, you know, operating a bar or a nightclub. Those are all shut down. The only exceptions are places that serve alcohol with a meal in an outdoor setting. And that means that, in fact, some owners have come together, banded together. You've seen bars and restaurants come together and say, okay, let's see if we can offer this together to fit into the state's mandate and eke out a little extra money. But, you know, we've talked to brew pubs and so forth that are selling for the first time cans of beer when in the past they had packed their establishment with people drinking at the bar. And they say, you know, we spoke to one owner in San Francisco who said that he had gone from a weekly average of over $100,000, sometimes $200,000 in revenue per week, down to now about $1,500. The Chamber of Commerce in San Francisco is reporting that, in fact, they think that about 1/3 of the restaurants in Chinatown in San Francisco may be forced to close. So it is just a swath of destruction, you know, moving through the small business community here.
Jake, how about the schools? Are teachers and students still heading back to the classroom? What are local districts doing?
You know, it is such a mixed set of signals that parents are getting here. And, you know, like with so many districts across the country, the news is coming very late and very suddenly to parents that they may, in fact, be home for a big chunk of the school year, at least through September, maybe even through December. You know, it's not clear. And at the same time, you have very different decisions being made district by district. San Jose Unified has now said that its teachers must, in fact, do the virtual instruction that everyone stuck at home is having to do. But those teachers have to give that instruction from the school. And so you can imagine that a working teacher who is also a parent suddenly has to find childcare, isn't sure what to do. There is no work from home option in that case. And so it is definitely a jumble of you know, a real jumble here. You've seen academics at UC Berkeley and elsewhere recommending that we should take advantage of the great outdoors, one of the great resources available to us in California, and make instruction something that can happen outdoors. But with school districts crunched here, with the student-teacher ratios already out of whack in a pre-coronavirus world, it's hard to imagine how you could have one teacher, you know, as many as 30, maybe even 40 kids in a class, all put together in one outdoor space. It's just an impossible situation for so many people. So definitely the system being stretched here in California, Alice.
No doubt. Jake Ward in the Bay Area, thanks so much. It's great to see you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.